Can you hear me okay? Is the mic system working? All right, great. I am not an academic. I think together with Scott Kersner, I'm the other sort of non-academic here today. I'm really looking forward to an interactive conversation if possible. I do have a few slides. I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. I run an organization called Cambridge Innovation Center, as you've heard. Just so I have an idea, how many of you have been to Cambridge Innovation Center or a Venture Cafe event or something like that? So maybe about a third of you, maybe half of you. So for the other half of you, we are just next door here. We've been around for about 20 years. We think we're the largest concentration of high-tech startups in one place anywhere on the planet. That's probably wrong. There's probably somewhere in China that's bigger, and we just don't know about it. But it's a building full of a lot of startups. And they asked me to come. I'm also an MIT grad. I went to MIT Sloan, class of 95. My mother actually taught at MIT negotiation for about 40 years. Hey, Carl. So I'm sort of a product of MIT as well. And as someone who's not strictly at MIT, but sort of very much part of this community, they said, hey, could you come and talk to folks that are interested in learning how they might integrate or work more closely with MIT and the Kendall Square ecosystem? How have we seen other companies do that? Those are the sorts of things that I'm going to talk about. And I'll hope to create a lot of space for questions. I think there's a clicker here. As I said, I'm going to go relatively quickly through the slides. So I have just a couple theoretical slides up front because I can't resist. I love this stuff. There was an era in innovation where it was largely done in isolation. This is actually Nikola Tesla's. We heard about Tesla, the other Tesla, a little bit earlier. This was his lab in the mountains in Colorado. He, as people know, was credited with huge advancements in radar and microwaves and that kind of area. And probably some of it was unsafe, but a lot of it he just didn't want anyone to know what he was working on. And that was kind of a way that a lot of people approached innovation. We then went through what I call the garage phase. And it's sort of proverbial, but it's actually true. This is exactly where a lot of the great innovators did their work. That's actually where Walt Disney, if you look closely, you'll see little models of Mickey in the back of his garage. And this kept costs low. This was like an easy way to get going when you didn't know whether your business was going to work or not. And we saw a lot of innovation come out of this kind of environment historically. I think Google also sort of got going, or maybe YouTube was one of those garages. So we're now seeing what is popularly referred to as innovation districts. I think you've probably heard a lot about that today. I saw Scott Stern on the agenda early in the morning, so I'm probably going to say a couple things that you've already heard, and I apologize for that. I'll just say them quickly at least, so you don't get too bored. But we are seeing innovation concentrating, both startups and these larger companies, into clumps. And why they're clumping together is not entirely clear, but it does seem that there's something around sort of learning and teaching going on, this sort of thing that we're doing right now today. My office is across the street. To walk over here took me 5 minutes. Carl and his team said, hey, can you come by and share what you've learned about this? I said, absolutely. So you're actually witnessing a little bit of what happens in innovation districts. This is not a big deal to come over here. They're not paying me. This is what we do, right, in an innovation district. You also see a lot of people meeting and becoming partners, right? You have probably most of the world's leading life sciences companies and most of the world's leading tech companies with a significant presence within a 5 or 10 minute walk of here. Given that that's true, and given that you're often eating in the same restaurants, drinking in the same bars, running into each other, and you do know each other. As people walked in, you may have seen me waving as various people walked in. That's how we get stuff done in an innovation district. It's through these relationships. So, Michael Davies, who's one of your presenters here, but who's also an entrepreneur, who also has his offices at CIC, also knocks on the door and says, hey, I have a business idea. Can you help me with this? Or I think, I might be able to help you. And that just happens essentially all day long in these environments. That's the exciting part about the kind of where the rubber hits the road for me anyway, as a business person here. Just briefly, I'll tell you a story of that, a real world story. Over the last year, I built a new business that, this is not public information, please don't tweet this, but where we had an issue within our workspaces where we wanted to keep them safe during COVID. And I guess I can take this mask off. You're allowed to do that, right? We had an issue of safety around COVID, and we wanted to do testing in our space. So we called a neighbor in Kendall Square, the Broad Institute, just down the street, and we said, could we bring samples, sort of nasal samples, to you, and you could process them and tell us whether our people have COVID? And they said, sure. Turned out to be inexpensive. We got that process working. And then a bunch of other organizations started calling. And then one thing led to another, and we're now testing all of the schools, 2,300 schools in Massachusetts, teachers and students, all the schools in Vermont, a bunch of schools in a bunch of other states. And then we got pulled also into vaccination. So we led the vaccination work in two of the big stadiums, Patriots Stadium at Gillette and Fenway Park. And this was, we're not a healthcare company. We had no experience in healthcare. We were just kind of we run office space and innovation spaces. We do run labs, so we understand a little bit about the science side. But this was actually just people connected to other people in Kendall Square. So we had the connection with the Broad Institute, which was down the street. One of our clients is a healthcare strategist and was close friends with Dr. Atul Gawande, the author who is also on Biden's COVID committee. And he introduced us. And we started chatting, and Dr. Gawande said, you know what, we really need help getting more tests out there. We said, sure, we can do that. And so one thing led to another, and we've now done, I think, 3 million tests and over 1 million vaccines, and we're the largest provider of both in New England. This is the sort of, just to really bring it to rubber hits the road, this is the sort of thing that happens when you're in a community of people who are talking regularly, where needs and opportunities are kind of connected. So you may have seen some of very similar data earlier on. Probably you did. I think Ralph was talking about information flows. This stuff is really near and dear to my heart. This is the first study is one that was done at MIT. This is not a Tom Allen study, but it's very much the same result. What it just shows is the distance in feet between researchers at MIT and how many papers that they published together collaboratively. They knew that there would be a weird effect where, of course, like let's say two researchers in the biology department, were more likely to do it together and they're physically together. So they actually took those out. This is only the papers where the people who are publishing it were in different departments, to kind of remove the effect of the fact that you might be sitting next to your usual partners. And so what you're seeing is that most of the collaboration happens within sort of 400 feet, a lot more in the next 2,000 feet. Which is about a half-mile radius. A half-mile, by the way, is about a 10-minute walk if you look on Google Maps. So what this is saying is, kind of 5-10-minute walk, that's about as far as you can go if you want to have like a lot of collaboration. The second chart is a Tom Allen. Everyone loves Tom. He's fantastic. This was one of his studies where he looked at communication between firms in the biotech industry. For some reason, the minimum distance they had was 7 kilometers. They just didn't, like if you're under 7, they put you in at 7. So what you see is essentially almost all of the collaboration. This is firms, contacts between firms, research institutes, university research organizations, and almost all the collaboration is right there in the kind of the near category. And it gives you that sense of how people tend to work. They work with people that they run into, build relationships with over time. Maybe kids go to the same school, all of those sorts of things. So that's not new. There is a simple formula that we have observed that kind of drives how you get kind of real innovation to flow. There are 3 sort of very simple resources you need. You obviously need money. You obviously need a flow of ideas, and then you need people who can put all that together, talent, right? So I'm not telling you anything that you don't all know in your bones. It is easy to remember this, by the way. The acronym that we use is MIT. It really stands out, sticks in the memory. So if you can find a way to get good access to capital, good access to a flow of ideas. This could be research institutions or other places where there's new stuff coming out regularly, and a high degree of talent quality, which, by the way, talent is, as you I think know, is concentrating more and more in the world into also clumping the way we saw earlier that startups clump. Talent, for instance, in life sciences is flowing to places like the Boston area and the Bay Area and just a few other places. So if you can get your your idea flow and your money and your talent into places with more of those things, that's where we're seeing most of the multiplying factor in terms of output of new businesses, new products, new services, and new technologies. So how did this happen here? This was Kendall Square in 1969. It looks a little bit like there might have been a post-apocalyptic event or something like that. There wasn't a lot here for those of you who've been around that long. A decade ago, it had filled in nicely, but also still with, I would say, kind of boring buildings, and it felt very much of a cooler, not cool, but less hot environment. But over the last couple decades, it's been doing that. This is under construction right now, and it's starting to look a lot more like this. Very high tech. We're seeing Kendall Square kind of come into its own, which is really exciting as the world has sort of recognized it as one of those technology concentrations and hotspots. And this is an area, if you walk out this side of the Marriott Hotel, you'll actually see the other side of that building. That little bit of brick in the back is this hotel. This is another of Scott Stern's pieces he may have shown. This is his older research from 2015. He plotted a heat map of where startups are, new enterprises are, in this physical area. And when I saw this, I brought a smile to my face because, let's see, does this have a button on it? Do I get a little laser shooting out of it? I don't know. That big red dot that you see, that's the corner of Broadway here and 3rd Street. And those of you who are nodding, that's where Cambridge Innovation Center is. That's the business that I founded. And I didn't pay him to do this, but what you're seeing is there's this incredible concentration right there in the center of Kendall Square and right around it. This is another visualization, if you will, of how innovation seems to clump. And it seems to do so naturally and for the reasons that I stated earlier. So what do you actually see at that corner? They did ask me to take just a moment to say what my organization CIC is, so I will say that, and then I'm going to back up and share a little bit about what we see global organizations doing as they come here. So we're CIC, the building across the street is One Broadway. We have something called Venture Cafe in there, which is a weekly gathering of entrepreneurs, free beer, people connect. The 245 Main Street is actually the other end of this very building. If I could kind of drill through that wall, you'd get into our innovation space over there. Organizations like Johnson & Johnson have their innovation space there. So we're talking about real physical space, like right here, essentially. It was founded in 1999. We've had about 8,500 organizations, either bigger companies or mostly startups, get started there over the last 20 years. We have about 2,000 organizations there now. This ranged from the largest, maybe 200 people, the smallest, maybe one person with just an idea. We count about 8 unicorn, sort of billion-plus valuation companies that have come through it. We do have labs as well in our system. We have about 525 lab benches, and that's growing fast. We're in 9 cities now. We just opened last year in Warsaw, Poland, and Tokyo, Japan. And we're growing this concept around the world, and we're in exploration about 8 more cities. So that's just a kind of a snapshot of who we are. Very quickly, some images. This is across the street, sort of what it looks like. It's workspace, it's gathering space, it's places where that you would expect that you'd get together. In Cambridge, Boston, I collaborated with some others to create a nonprofit called Lab Central, which is now also building space across the street. It is, to our knowledge, the largest shared wet laboratory space in the world. So if you're kind of going into a space and you're doing a little bit of life sciences research, and you don't want to build your own lab, that's where you would go in this area. And I collaborated with another group of people, including the head of the laboratory, the computer science lab at MIT, Daniela Roos, and the CEO of iRobot and some others, to create something called Mass Robotics, which is across the river in Boston, and it's, we believe, the world's largest concentration of robotics startups in one building. And you've got about 60, 70 robotics startups all crammed together, sharing equipment and ideas and learning and all the stuff that we're talking about today. So this is kind of how this neighborhood works. It's these concentrations of folks that are doing similar things, that have something to offer. They may have money, ideas, or talent. They're connecting with each other. I thought I'd share stories of just a few select organizations that I know a little bit about their stories. All of these organizations for this area began at Cambridge Innovation Center. if we were to show all the organizations in Kendall Square, there'd be like 1,000 of them. So I can't show them all, but these are just some stories I wanted to share. So I'll start with Android, now part of Google, of course. Android began, as some know, as a startup. It was a guy named Rich Miner on the East Coast who graduated from the University of Lowell. And he had a partner on the West Coast. They had done several different, they each done a bunch of startups together. Rich had sold a startup for $200 million already. So these are not like kind of green entrepreneurs that didn't know what they were doing. These are people with resources. Very creative guy. And he had this idea to do an open source mobile phone operating system. So basically like Linux, but for mobile phones. And everyone thought that was a little weird. They were working on it for, the story goes, and I'm going to tell you the story that people think was the story, but nobody really knows what the story was, and I certainly don't. Although Rich is a friend, he hasn't sort of opened up. But the story goes that they were working on this for like 4 months. They got a call from the folks at Google, said, hey, we'd like to buy you. They said, no, we're too early. And supposedly Google sent them a check for $1 million and said, if you come and talk to us and we don't cut a deal, you can keep this. And they said, okay, we'll talk. Now, I don't know if this is true. This is just kind of what you hear. But in any case, it did become part of Google. So Google did not want to build this on the West Coast. It was very secret. They wanted to have kind of a different team focused on it. But interestingly, they put it at Cambridge Innovation Center. And it grew for the first 3 years there. The tech was built here. As I understand it, the business side of it was built on the West Coast. And they then turned this into what is now, I believe, by devices, if you include both phones and mobile and tablets, I believe it's about 90% of the world's mobile OSs are either Android or a derivative of Android, partly also due to all the Chinese use of the derivatives of Android. When they came here, they just were a couple of people. After about a year, they were 30 people. After maybe another 6 months, they were 80 people. 6 months later, about 200 people. And they still at CIC. And we said, you guys have to leave because we don't have enough space for you. And so they looked around and they rented some space right here. Actually, I'm trying to think, it's the next building over that way. From Boston Properties, and they got a couple floors of a building. They took more floors, and then they sort of rented the building next door, and then they took down the building, another building, and they're building a tower, and they're in like 3-ish buildings, and I think they have several thousand people there working. And what they did was they started with this Android project, but then they kind of dropped other projects on. They put the Google Books project on, and just myriad other projects where they just said, hey, we'll just park that one in Cambridge. There's good talent here. So this is a pattern that we see in terms of how a lot of these organizations kind of work. They'll start with just a little bit of a presence. They typically choose to locate right next to MIT because of the talent flows. And as I mentioned earlier, you've got that money, ideas, talent. It's the idea flow is the other piece that's coming out of a place like MIT. So Amazon, famously, they had actually had no tech outside of Seattle at the time that they opened a small office here. It was, in fact, initially until about 80 or 100 people at CIC. They then took a bunch of space in the building immediately next door, which is kind of behind the letter CIC. It's 101 Main Street. They took several floors there. And then they announced that they we're going to do this search for a second headquarters for Amazon. I'm sure you all remember this. It was big. It was big news, and every city in the world, it seems like, kind of put in a bid to be the second headquarters of Amazon. It was kind of a clever. Bezos is a clever guy, and they announced in the end, I think it was going to be in New York, and then that kind of fell through, and I don't even know where it ultimately went. But they said, oh, and by the way, we're going to just continue growing dramatically in the Boston area. Unrelated to that, because this is where, so they started looking for space for 5,000 or 10,000 people, and they had just found it was a talent base that they wanted to build on. But it started with, I think the first team was 5 or 10 people from Amazon, and I remember they asked us, would we be able to do special armored conduit that their internet lines would run through, so that because they were working on some secret new projects for Amazon, which I believe later came out that was the Fire Phone. They weren't yet in phones, but I don't know if that's exactly what it was. But And so they said, we can do this. We can both Google and Amazon said we can do kind of secret future projects, but still within this intense collaborative environment. And that's a trend and a theme that I think not everyone immediately gets. That it doesn't, just because you're in a collaborative kind of innovation district, it doesn't mean that everyone knows the things you're working on. This could be some of the most advanced stuff in your business that you want to keep quiet, and still you do it in these environments for the reasons I mentioned earlier. The stories go on. Amazon, it was an interesting moment where they had the option on taking the space at 101 Main Street, like there's a couple floors, so probably like 50, 60,000 feet, something like that. And they also had an option literally on top of the South Station Railway site in downtown Boston. And that was about $10 a square foot cheaper, and arguably the most convenient place you could be if you wanted to be able to get around, because you could just go right down onto Amtrak, there was also there's a special link to the airport from there, if you may know. And they ended up deciding to pay the more money and come over here to 101 Main. And what they said was, well, their whole point to be here was the talent, and this is where the talent was. And so I just thought that was an interesting kind of insight in terms of how these companies sort of think through these sorts of conversations. I'll tell another story, Shell TechWorks. So Shell, big, long-standing, obviously, organization, one of the most valuable companies in the world, depending on exactly when you look at it. They decided they really need to kind of turn their technology thinking upside down. So they're a Dutch company. They had massive research centers in the Netherlands, which I've actually been to. They're great. But they're like walled campuses. They're like castles. You go through several layers of security, and then it's like going to a Boeing research facility if you've ever done that. And then you're kind of in Shell land, right? And they said, this isn't going to work. We've got to, if we're really going to kind of think through what the future of the business is, we have to have something outside of Shell, something which is kind of a little bit naked. And so they put 3 people at Cambridge Innovation Center, which is, you'd think, oh, is this going to change Shell? But it was a really big deal for them. And they said, this is great. We're like meeting all kinds of people. A lot of technology, a lot of connections. So then they said, okay, it's going to be like 20 people. And we didn't actually have enough space at the time to have them all next to each other. So we ended up kind of breaking them up a little bit into a couple different groups in different places in the center. They said, we love this. So they said, okay, now we're going to make this 200 people. And we said, okay, well, we've only got one place that can fit that. It's in the 101 Main building. It's sort of half of a floor. And their security guys came in and said, of course, now we're going to put like Shell rules on this. So we got to have like special locks on the doors and badges and things like that. And we're like, okay, we can do that. And they did all that. And then the guy who was running it came to me and he said, this is not working anymore. And this is, please don't, they'll probably get pissed at me to say this, but he said, we used to talk all the time with everybody. And now we're like in our own sort of very secure, beautiful space, and we're not talking to anybody anymore. And so I just share that. I'm sure that they went on to do other things to try to fix that, and I'm sure they did. So this is not the end of the story. But my point is that part of what you're actually looking for is, in fact, those sort of permeable edges to your organization, and figuring out how to build kind of bits of your organization that are both super secure and secret, like Amazon, but also bits where you're kind of connecting to everyone. Is super important. I don't think I have time to keep telling more stories along these lines, so I'll pause and see if there are any questions. Okay. How will the collaborative, shall I just?
We've got it right here.
Okay, great. All right.
How will the collaborative innovation space in Kendall Square evolve in the next 10 years, 10 years?
Well, it is evolving right now as we speak. So MIT built a really exciting organization called MIT The Engine, which is a kind of a deep tech, I think you heard about deep tech earlier today, research space, and they're growing that significantly. They're building more of what the kinds of things I was telling you about, like wet lab space or robotic space, more of the specialized kind of space that new companies doing really hard things. I don't know all the technologies they'll go into, but if I were in their shoes, I'd be looking at nuclear, let's say you're a nuclear technology startup. You're going to need very special gear and so forth, and they're building an environment that has that sort of thing. So you're going to see more of this. We are growing. The federal government, in its wisdom, just sold a huge plot of land just that way, from like immediately next door that way, which was the Volpe Transportation Safety Systems Center. They sold it to MIT. And that's going to be millions of square feet of new space that crops up just in the next couple of years right over there. So this, like many of these hub cities, you're just seeing a ballooning of the science and technology that's going on here. One interesting thing about what you see in Kendall Square is that it's essentially 100% innovation. In other words, you do not see large law firms, you do not see large financial services firms. There's basically nothing here which isn't hardcore innovation, and that's actually kind of cool, right? I don't think there are many places in the world that have that kind of concentration. It's not like there's a law about it, but if you if you show up and you say, you know, I'm here to put my, you know, kind of my claims processing, or I don't know what, you know, old school normal business, nobody comes here like that. What do I do tomorrow morning in practice if I want my organization to be more involved in Kendall Square? Michael Davies and I were talking about this a little bit. So there's I won't name names, but there is a large respected European technology services company that has you know, a person in Kendall Square and has done for about 20 years. And we like this person. It's always been one person.
Tim, I spoke with him.
Yeah?
Name names.
Really?
Yes.
Well, I'm not going to do that. It might be a large British telecom company, but it's you know, hard to know. The point is that we don't think that works. That the one person who's sort of here to kind of talk and sort of like get some ideas, that doesn't seem to then translate into, you know, what Google's built or what Amazon's built and so forth. Michael's view, and I agree with it, is that you need to do some sort of actual research or actual project or product here. You have to have a full team. So examples, Toyota put the Toyota Research Institute here. I think it's 30, 40 people. It's, you know, 5 minutes walk that way. They said, look, the future is self-driving cars, which is really like a larger version of robotics plus AI. Those are things that this area is amongst the leading, you know, places in the world. So we're gonna really double down on having presence here to figure that stuff out. I'm talking to another large Asian automotive company that's thinking the very same thing right now. So in practice, I think what you want to do is put a team. It needs to be a team working on something real that matters to your company. Think 5, 8 people as a starting point. And if that works out for you, then think about, you know, doing more. But don't just knock on doors.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for joining us.